Before Rome and Babylon, before the pyramids were old, a city rose beside the rivers of Mesopotamia and tried to gather the world into its hands. Its name was Akkad, a place now lost to time, yet once so powerful that its kings called themselves rulers of the four quarters of the earth. From that vanished capital came inventions that would define civilization: standing armies, written laws, organized taxation. Every government that dreams of unity, every ruler who imagines himself chosen, walks in Akkad's footsteps. This is the story of how that dream began. Their legacy rippled outward through Babylon, Assyria, and every civilization that followed. They marched across the plain in silence, their shields locking like the walls of a moving city. Bronze caught the sunlight, and the air shimmered with heat and the smell of bitumen. Behind them, the banners of Lagash swayed, painted cloth stitched with the image of a god clutching a lion. Ahead lay Umma, its irrigation ditches turned to trenches, its farmers turned to soldiers. Between them stretched the Guadina, the fertile strip of earth both cities claimed as their birthright. It was not a battle of kings and crowns yet, but of priests and gods. The men of Umma shouted the name of their god, Shara. Those of Lagash called upon Ningirsu, the Storm Lord. When Eonatum of Lagash gave the signal, the lines surged forward, a phalanx of shouting men pressing bronze-tipped spears into the mud. The riverbanks shook with their footsteps. Above them, vultures circled, as if the gods themselves had arrived early to feed. Later, scribes would carve the victory into stone, the famous stele of vultures, a slab that still shows Eonatum trampling his enemies beneath his sandals. His triumph was not over one city alone, but over a pattern older than memory. For centuries, Sumer had been a land divided, a necklace of city-states strung along the rivers, each with its own god, its own laws, its own hunger for the fields beyond its walls. War was the rhythm of their politics. Lagash fought Umma, Ur warred with Uruk, and even Kish, far to the north, claimed the title King of the World. When the rivers flooded too high or too low, when canals silted, when barley failed, armies marched. The world of the Sumerians was not built on peace, but on a system of controlled violence. Behind the lines of spearmen stood the real heart of Sumer, the temples. These were not houses of prayer as we imagine them, but vast economic engines, warehouses of grain, herds, and labor. Every harvest passed through the house of the god. There, priests and scribes counted, sealed, and redistributed the fruits of the land. The temple fed the poor and paid the soldiers. The gods owned the soil, and the kings were merely their stewards. The cities glittered with ambition. In Uruk, the white temple rose above the steppe like a mountain built by men's hands. Its terraces smelled of bitumen and baked clay, and its walls bore the names of kings whose lines stretched into legend. One such name, Gilgamesh, would one day eclipse all others, half man, half myth. In his lifetime he was merely another city ruler, building walls against the floods and the armies of his neighbors. But in death, his story would outlast the empire of his birth. The scribes of Uruk had already begun to write when his masons laid those first bricks. On clay tablets, they pressed the earliest cuneiform signs, tiny wedges recording grain rations, debts, prayers. In time, the marks grew into words, and the words into literature. The people of Sumer, who had once told stories by firelight, now preserved them in clay. They invented history by accident. Across the southern plain, the ziggurats rose, terraced towers meant to bridge heaven and earth. In Eridu, they said the first temple had been built by the god Enki himself. In the moon god Nana watched from a shrine of gleaming brick. Every city was a small universe, ruled by its own divine order. The priests of Nippur told that their god, Enlil, ruled over all others, and for that reason, every conqueror in Sumer, even the most arrogant, would kneel in his temple before claiming the crown. But not all the people of Sumer spoke the same tongue. Along the northern borders, in Kish and the Diyala Valley, a different language hummed in the markets. A harsh, quick speech carried by merchants and mercenaries from the west. They were Semites, traders from the lands of Mari and Ebla, who brought cedar, copper, and tin, and who learned to write their own names in the Sumerian script. Some served Sumerian kings, others ruled cities of their own. In Kish, the line between Sumerian and Semite had already blurred. The future, though no one yet saw it, would speak in their tongue. The plain itself was changing. The twin rivers, Tigris and Euphrates, shifted their beds year by year, abandoning canals and drowning fields. Villages that had once prospered now stood dry and cracked. Harvests shrank. To the people, these were not accidents of climate, but judgments from the gods. Each city blamed another. Each temple accused its rival of stealing divine favor. In this fevered landscape, Lugalzagezi rose. Once ruler of the modest city of Umma, he burned Lagash, sacked its temples, and declared himself lord of all Sumer. Inscriptions boast that he united 25 cities under his rule and washed his weapons in the sea. For the first time, Sumer bowed to one crown, or pretended to. But his victory was brittle. The cities obeyed because they were exhausted. The canals lay dry, the storehouses empty. Behind his proclamations, the land groaned with famine. And somewhere in the ruins of Kish, a young man was watching. He was not born to rule. He was born to serve. The court scribes would later claim that he had once poured wine for Uzababa, king of Kish, that he had carried the royal cup before he carried a sword. Others whispered that he was a foundling, set adrift on the Euphrates in a basket of reeds and rescued by a gardener. It did not matter which story was true. Both said the same thing, that he rose from nothing and was chosen by the gods. His name, when he chose it, would be Sargon, Sharukin, the true king. But for now, he was only another servant in a collapsing world. The south had fallen under Lugalzagezi's banners. The north was fractured by revolt. Armies moved through the dust like flocks of cranes, loyal to whoever fed them that week. The priests prayed louder. The scribes kept count of grain that no longer existed. The canals dried. The vultures fattened. Sumer had built the first cities, the first writing, the first temples, and with them, the first chaos. It was a civilization that had learned how to command men, but not yet how to command itself. No one in those years could have guessed that they stood at the edge of an age. To them, the wars were only another cycle of offense and revenge. But centuries later, when archaeologists sifted the tablets from the ruins, they would see it clearly. The storm before empire, the crucible in which kingship itself was forged. From the walls of Lagash to the ziggurat of Uruk, from the mud brick houses of Kish to the reed huts along the canals, a whisper spread that the gods were displeased, that Sumer's order had broken, that the divine balance had tilted toward a new power. In the temples, priests debated omens. In the markets, merchants hoarded barley and silver. Soldiers wandered between loyalties. And somewhere in the shadows, the cupbearer watched and waited, learning what every great conqueror must learn before he seizes the world. That power begins not with birth, but with hunger. The wars of the city-states would soon give way to something new, a kingdom without boundaries, a language that could rule many tongues, a system of rule that would echo down through Rome and beyond. But in that moment, the men of Lagash still lifted their spears. The priests of Nippur still counted their offerings, and the fields of Guadina still glowed red at sunset. They could not know that their age was ending. The dust they raised on that battlefield would settle in the lungs of a boy who would one day call himself king of the world. The palace of Kish smelled of spiced wine and fear. Courtiers drifted through its pillared halls whispering about omens, dreams of rivers running backward, the moon stained with blood, the gods abandoning their shrines. In the shadow of the throne stood Sargon, the king's cupbearer, silent as a servant should be. Every day he filled the royal cup, and every day he listened, to priests muttering of revolt, to generals boasting of victories that never came, to a king whose laughter cracked like a clay mask. Urzababa, lord of Kish, ruled a land unraveling. The canals silted, the markets shrank, and rival cities conspired against him. His dreams grew worse. One night, he saw his servant standing over him, the cup in Sargon's hand overflowing until it drowned the palace. He woke shaking. Before dawn, he summoned the captain of his guard and ordered that the cupbearer be removed, quietly, permanently. The attempt failed. Some said the assassin's sword turned in his grip. Others, that Ishtar, goddess of fortune and war, shielded the young man with her light. By morning, Sargon was gone, fled into the plains, vanishing down the trade roads toward Uruk, where Lugal-Zaggisi held court over the smoldering remains of Sumer's independence. Legends later softened the truth. They said he had begun as a foundling, set adrift in a basket on the Euphrates, saved by a gardener and blessed by Ishtar herself. The story was myth, but its meaning was true enough. Sargon was the child of chance and river water, born without lineage, armed only with ambition. In the marshes north of Uruk, he began to gather followers, mercenaries, outlaws, men ruined by the endless wars of the city-states. He promised them something they had never heard before: regular pay, steady rations, and a leader who shared their hardships. His army was not a seasonal levy called from the fields, but a permanent corps trained and loyal only to him. 5,400 soldiers, organized and disciplined, an invention as dangerous as the sword itself. Word of this force reached Lugal-Zaggisi, the self-proclaimed unifier of Sumer. The king laughed when he heard it. How could a runaway servant challenge the lord of 25 cities? But laughter is a fragile defense. Soon scouts brought darker news. The fugitive had taken Kish, then marched south, his banners black with soot and stars. When the armies met near the gates of Uruk, the earth shook beneath the charge. Sargon's men fought in swift lines, not the old Sumerian phalanxes of locked shields and slow advances. They carried composite bows, their arrows slicing through armor, and their movements were as fluid as the rivers they followed. The air filled with dust and screams, and in that choking storm, the old order died. Lugal-Zaggisi was captured alive. Sargon bound him in chains and paraded him north to Nippur, the sacred city of Enlil, whose judgment no mortal could escape. There, before the god's great temple, he laid his prisoner in the dirt. Behind him stood 50 defeated rulers, their necks yoked together with ropes. The new conqueror bowed to Enlil and declared that the god himself had granted him rule over Sumer. From that day, he ceased to be a servant. He called himself Sharukin, Sargon, the true king. The title spread across the land like a storm. Sargon did not rebuild Kish, nor settle in Uruk. He founded a new capital altogether, a city unbound by old loyalties and priestly debts. Its name was Akkad, and its walls rose from fresh earth near the great bend of the Euphrates. No shrine stood at its heart, no god owned it. It was a city of the state itself, a monument to human will. The streets of Akkad thrummed with life. Merchants from Mari, Elam, and the Levant crowded its markets. Scribes pressed wet clay into tidy stacks of tablets, recording rations, taxes, and commands. Soldiers drilled in the courtyards, their bronze helmets gleaming in the sun. For the first time, the tongue of power was not Sumerian, but Akkadian, a Semitic language once spoken only by traders and herdsmen, now shaped into the vocabulary of empire. Sargon ruled through systems rather than chance. He placed loyal governors in every city, created garrison towns to watch the frontiers, and built a network of messengers, the Mar Shipri, men of the road, who galloped between the provinces carrying orders sealed in clay. Through them, the empire spoke with one voice, quick and absolute. But conquest was not enough. To rule a world of temples, a king needed the gods on his side. Sargon turned to faith, not as a penitent, but as an architect. In the city of Ur, he installed his daughter Enheduanna as high priestess of the moon god Nana. Her appointment was both sacred and political, a human bridge between the ancient Sumerian cults and the new Akkadian power. From the terraces of Ur, Enheduanna wrote hymns to the goddess Inanna, whom her people also called Ishtar. Her poetry sang of divine love and cosmic battle, of the goddess who chose Sargon and guided his conquests. Those verses, 42 hymns in all, were the first works of literature ever signed by a human name. Her words spread from temple to temple, uniting the languages of conqueror and conquered in worship and awe. Through her, Sargon gave his empire a soul. Beyond the temples, the king's armies continued their relentless march. To the east, he crossed the mountains into Elam, crushing its kings and seizing its mines of copper and tin. To the west, he reached the cedar forests of Byblos, where his men felled the tall trees that would roof the palaces of Akkad. His fleet sailed along the Persian Gulf, trading with islands of pearl and copper, Dilmun, Magan, even the far ports of Meluha, where lapis lazuli gleamed like frozen night. In his own inscriptions, Sargon boasted that he washed his weapons in both seas, the upper and the lower, and ruled from sunrise to sunset. Behind the poetry lay an astonishing reality. For the first time in history, a single hand governed the known world. He did not call himself a god, not yet. His greatness was measured not in divinity, but in reach. The number of provinces, the weight of tribute, the languages that now carried his decrees. He appointed no royal bloodline to follow him, only loyal men bound by service, not kin. That was his genius and his danger. At night, from the roof of his palace, Sargon could see the fires of Akkad stretching along the river, like constellations fallen to earth. Somewhere among them, the scribes of the city worked late into the dark, scratching the new name of the world onto wet clay. The priests of Sumer grumbled in their sanctuaries that no man should hold such power, that Enlil's favor could not be bought with victories. But the temples still filled with offerings. The canals ran clear again, and the caravans returned laden with copper, silver, and cedar. The people whispered prayers to Ishtar, half in fear and half in gratitude. Sargon had done what none before him had dreamed possible. He had turned the fragments of Sumer into a single realm, its borders guarded by discipline rather than by myth. In doing so, he had invented the idea of empire, No monument of him survives, his capital still lost beneath uncharted soil, but his shadow remained. Every conqueror after would trace his name on their crowns, whether they knew it or not. From the clay he ruled, history itself took shape, and somewhere along the river, the cup that once trembled in a servant's hand gleamed beneath the torchlight of a throne. At dawn, the kings studied the map carved in clay. Tiny rivers ran across its surface like veins. Pins marked the cities that bent the knee and those that still stood defiant. The rooms smelled of wax and damp earth. Sargon leaned over the table and pressed his finger into the eastern edge, the place his scouts called Elam, a country of red hills and stubborn kings. He went east first, toward the mountains. The air grew thin, and the rains came sideways, cold as stone. The men of Akkad, used to the flat shimmer of Suma's plains, climbed roads that coiled like serpents through the passes. The enemy fought from cliffs and gullies, not with phalanxes but with ambush and fire. For days the sky stayed black with smoke from burning villages. When the battle finally broke, it was a slaughter. Elam's ruler, Luishan, was dragged before the conqueror in a net of bronze chains. From Susa came tribute, silver measured by the talent, copper by the hundredweight, lapis carried in baskets of reed. Sargon installed his own governors, left local lords as vassals, and returned west with the wealth of the highlands behind him. The tablets from this time list 7 talents of silver and 80 of copper delivered yearly, a dry accounting that cannot capture the sound of victory echoing across the valleys. In the conquered cities, Akkadian scribes set up their tables beside the old Sumerian ones. The language of command changed, but the rhythm of life endured. A scribe at Susa, his hands still smelling of clay, copied the new king's decree. The gods of Akkad watch over you. Pay your due and prosper. Empire was not only conquest, it was administration, and every ledger was a weapon. From there, Sargon turned west. He crossed the middle Euphrates, following the trade roads toward Mari and Ebla, cities rich in silver and cedar oil. Mari fell quickly. Its palace guard melted before the Akkadian ranks. Ebla held longer, a city of scribes and merchants who believed walls could buy time. But when the fires reached their archives, the clay tablets baked hard, preserving their words for thousands of years. Later ages would unearth them and find the name Sharakin scrawled in the wreckage. The roads west grew dry and bright, flanked by acacia trees and the smell of salt. When Sargon reached the mountains of Lebanon, he found forests unlike any in the south. Cedars tall as towers, their trunks bleeding resin. The king watched his men fell the trees, each swing of the axe releasing a ghost of perfume. Those timbers would roof the temples of Akkad and the shrines of Ishtar. He sent envoys to the coastal ports, Byblos, Arwad, Sidon, and left merchants in his wake. Empire traveled by ship as surely as by sword. He had promised his people that he would reach the ends of the world, and he kept the vow. The tablets speak of his 11 great campaigns, of 34 battles, and of the moment when he washed his weapons in the upper sea. To the scribes, that phrase meant victory. To Sargon himself, it was ritual. He stood at the edge of the Mediterranean, the water cold around his ankles, and lifted his sword toward the sun. Behind him, the banners of Akkad fluttered against the horizon. He had turned geography into theology. After the west came the south. His fleet sailed the lower sea, the Persian Gulf, where the waters shimmered green as copper. The ships returned laden with ore from Magan, pearls from Dilmun, carnelian and lapis from Meluha, the distant Indus, where the people spoke another language, but measured trade in the same silver rings. The empire's borders were not walls, but networks, invisible lines of exchange. Even so, Sargon ruled not only by conquest, but by system. Every captured city kept its governor, Ensi, they called them. But those men now answered to Akkad. Grain was tallied, silver weighed, soldiers counted. A third of each harvest went to the state, another share to the temples. The fields were divided between the gods, the crown, and the people who worked them. What could have been oppression became efficiency, at least for a time. Messengers galloped between provinces with tablets sealed in bitumen. A governor in Lagash could write to Akkad and receive a reply within a week. A miracle of communication. Weights and measures were standardized, contracts enforced. The calendar aligned across the land. Even rebellion became part of the pattern. The king expected it, crushed it, and rebuilt what he had destroyed. For the first time, the world functioned as a single system. In the streets of Akkad, merchants from Elam haggled with traders from the Levant. Priests of Sumerian birth performed rituals in Akkadian tongues. The old gods were not abolished, but reimagined. Enlil, Shamash, Ishtar, Nana. Their names shifted across languages, but kept their power. Enheduanna's hymns traveled farther than her father's armies, binding the conquered with poetry instead of chains. Through her verses, the empire learned to worship as one. She wrote of Ishtar rising from battle, her feet on the corpses of the arrogant, and of a king chosen to bring unity. Those hymns were read aloud in temples from Ur to Mari, giving divine shape to the political order Sargon had forged by force. Religion had become administration by other means. In the evenings, when the sun reddened the western sky, the king would climb the walls of Akkad and look toward the horizon. He had seen both seas. He had held the mountains and the desert. The gods had given him the 4 quarters of the world, and yet his gaze was restless. Beyond the light, the lands he had not seen called like a dream he could not wake from. The chronicles say that Sargon ruled for 56 years, but numbers mean little beside the weight of what he created. He began as a servant and became a symbol, a man who proved that destiny could be made, not inherited. His empire was a living experiment, its pulse beating through scribes' tablets, soldiers' marches, priests' prayers. No stone monument remains to mark where Akkad stood, but its shadow stretches across every power that came after. It was here, in the time of Sargon, that history first realized it could expand forever, and that the world, once conquered, would never again be small. The city of Akkad glittered like a forge at dawn. Smoke rose from workshops along the riverbanks, where metalworkers hammered bronze into helmets and seals, and scribes pressed tablets that recorded the rhythm of an empire. At its center stood the royal palace, walls inlaid with lapis, floors paved with baked brick. In the throne room, under banners of Ishtar's star, the king received envoys from every quarter of the known world. He had begun his reign as Shah Kishatim, king of totality, but now Sargon's titles multiplied with his dominion. King of the 4 quarters of the world, the scribes wrote, the words curling like vines around his name. To his subjects, the phrase meant that the gods had stretched his rule to the ends of the earth, north, south, east, and west. It was a title older than empire and newer than the clay it was written on, a claim to cosmic order itself. The stele that proclaimed his victories stood in every city square. On them, Sargon appeared larger than life, his beard neat, his muscles carved with the confidence of eternity. Around his figure swirled inscriptions of triumph. 34 battles won, 11 campaigns completed. both seas conquered. The images were more than art. They were instruments of faith. In Akkad, propaganda was devotion. The royal artisans knew their purpose, to turn history into myth before it cooled. In temples, from Eridu to Susa, priests read aloud the king's inscriptions as if they were hymns. The act of conquest became a liturgy, obedience, a sacrament. Among these creations was the Sargon birth legend, a tale told and retold for generations. In it, a woman of low station hides her newborn in a basket of reeds, sealing it with pitch and setting it afloat on the Euphrates. The river bears the child to safety, and a gardener raises him until the goddess Ishtar herself chooses him for greatness. To later ages, the story would echo in distant scriptures, but in Sargon's time, it served a single purpose: to sanctify power born from nothing. It was clever theology. In a world where kings claimed descent from gods, Sargon claimed the gods had adopted him. He was not divine, but chosen. His authority a living miracle, renewed with every victory. The cult of Ishtar thrived under his patronage. Her star blazed from seals, helmets, and palace gates. Soldiers swore by her name before battle. Generals offered her prisoners after. On feast days, processions carried her golden statue through Akkad's avenues, draped in blue linen and heavy with incense. The goddess of love and war was also the goddess of empire, her dual nature mirroring Sargon's own, conqueror and creator, destroyer and builder. Still, no empire grows without resistance. The cities he had conquered still whispered rebellion. In the 3rd year of his reign, Ur and Lagash rose together, burning the Akkadian garrison at Adab and calling on Enlil to curse the usurper. The revolt was crushed within weeks. The rebel priests were paraded through the streets in chains, their temples stripped of treasure. But Sargon did not destroy them all. Instead, he built an intelligence network, spies and messengers who watched the cities like hawks. The Akkadian phrase, Ma Shipri, man of the road, came to mean more than courier. It meant observer, recorder, rumor bearer. Through them, Sargon ruled not just the land, but the flow of information. When he visited Nippur, the spiritual heart of Sumer, he came not as conqueror, but as supplicant. There, in the temple of Enlil, he offered gifts of gold and lapis, bowing until his forehead touched the floor. The priests, impressed or frightened, proclaimed that Enlil had confirmed his kingship. To rule Sumer was one thing, to be accepted by its gods was another. The alliance between power and piety deepened. Sargon rebuilt temples across the land, 65 in all, according to the tablets. Each reconstruction was both an act of worship and an assertion of control. To restore a god's house was to claim its favor. The gods of Akkad, Shamash the sun, Sin the moon, Adad the storm, were woven into Sumer's pantheon like threads of a new tapestry. The result was not the destruction of older faiths, but their absorption. The empire grew through syncretism as much as through steel. A new form of royal inscription emerged during these years, the Naru, or Stela of Memory. Carved on diorite or bronze, these monuments carried not only deeds, but personality, a voice speaking directly from the stone. Sargon, king of the world, dedicated this statue, reads one found near modern Dohuk, the base of what was once a shining bronze effigy. The style would endure for 2 millennia, adopted by Assyrian, Babylonian, and Persian kings alike. Even the language of the inscriptions carried meaning. They were written in both Sumerian and Akkadian, each reinforcing the other. To read them required 2 literacies, 2 worlds coexisting under one rule. The duality mirrored the empire itself. Bilingual, bicultural, balanced between inheritance and invention. For all its grandeur, the machine of empire was never still. Beyond its borders, new enemies stirred. The Amorites roamed the western deserts. In the east, the tribes of the Zagros tested their strength against Akkadian garrisons. Each victory fed Sargon's legend, and each rebellion reminded him that conquest never ended. It only changed its shape. Sometimes, late in his reign, he would walk the upper terrace of his palace, where the wind carried the scents of clay and cedar. The city beneath him murmured with 1,000 tongues, merchants arguing in the market, scribes chanting accounts, soldiers drilling in the courtyards. Akkad was no longer a city, but a heartbeat. From the roof, he could see the temple of Ishtar, its golden dome reflecting the sun. Inside, priests tended her eternal flame. The goddess who had raised him from the river still guarded his throne. Or so he believed. In the royal archives, new tablets were added daily. Some listed tribute: silver from Elam, copper from Magan, timber from Byblos. Others carried prophecies, omens read from stars, birds, and dreams. The priests wrote that the gods favored the king, who maintained balance, who punished rebellion but restored worship, who built as well as conquered. Sargon had mastered that balance for half a century. Few rulers after him would manage the same. In time, his name would become formulaic. Sargon the Great, the archetype of the king who rules the world. Every later monarch who reached beyond his borders would invoke him, consciously or not. To be called King of the Four Quarters was to step into his shadow. But in his own age, Sargon was simply a man who refused to stay within the limits of birth. His story began with a cup of wine and ended with a cup raised to the heavens. Between the two stretched the first empire. Armies, temples, languages, and laws bound together by a single idea. That authority could reach as far as the imagination dared. The world had learned a new rhythm. Cities no longer thought of themselves as the universe's center, but as parts of something vaster. Kingship had become an axis around which the four quarters turned, and at that axis stood Sargon, servant of Ishtar, chosen of Enlil, king of everything that breathed between the rivers and beyond them. News of Sargon. The Great's death rode ahead of dusk on lathered horses. Courtyards fell quiet, priests pinched out wicks, governors sealed storerooms and counted spears. What he had stitched together with campaign and decree shivered as if a hand had lifted from the loom. In his place stepped Rymush, a blade of a man, watchful, spare, impatient with hesitation. He wore the crown like a helmet and spoke as if every word had to cross a battlefield. Loyalty, he believed, grew only where fear had been ploughed. Before the coronation torches burned out, hoisted its banners. Umma answered. Adab and Lagash called their levies to the walls. From Elam came raiders testing the frontier. Rymush rolled up proclamations, reached for iron, and moved. Numbers endure where faces fade. In and Umma, in the dust between Lagash and Adab, the scribes pressed their grief into clay. Thousands fallen, thousands taken. The figures grew heavy with meaning, until each mark on the tablet felt like a curse. Yet terror traveled with a plan. Walls came down so garrisons could see further. Prisoners were marched to canal estates and set to dredging silt. Roads reopened under cavalry patrols until copper from the east and barley from the south flowed again toward Akkad. Where his father had seduced, Rymush coerced. Order returned, wearing a mailed fist. Letters from this reign sound like a man who sleeps with one eye open. Officials are named, watched, and weighed. Dreams are noted as warnings. Punishments are timed like eclipses. Ink, well, clay, hardens the mood. No metaphor, little patience. A ruler counting shadows. Year 8 cracked like a hidden beam. Court omen books remember a king struck down by his own household, beaten with cylinder seals, the very tools that had stamped his will into clay. Administration turned weapon. A signature became a cudgel. Whether the body lay in state or vanished into a secret pit, the tablets refused to say. Manishtushu arrived not as a savior, but as a different grammar of power. Some called him Rimish's twin, others merely his brother. Either way, he had watched the purges and understood what fear could not buy. To hold an empire, you had to make it profitable for those who carried it. He preferred silver to slogans. Where Rimush crushed, Manishtushu converted. Courts hummed again. Caravan bells replaced funeral drums. Governors were reminded that tribute and calm are twins. Early in his reign, the king sent 32 ships across the Persian Gulf. Oars beat a steady hour through green water toward Megan, where mountains glittered with ore. Fighting happened there. No conquest can be accounted for without it, but the goal was simpler. Secure copper and bring home black diorite for statues heavy as commandments. A black monolith records his mind, the Manishtushu obelisk, not boast, but ledger, 3,400 hectares of land purchased north of Akkad, parcels listed with witnesses, boundaries, and prices in silver. Kings before had seized. This one bought, then parceled estates to veterans and officials. Ownership, not terror, would tie men to the throne. The idea feels modern because it is eternal. Pay me, and I will defend you. Own with me, and you are me. East again, Elam stirred. Manishtushu rode to Susa, set Eshpum in the governor's chair, and returned with temples pacified and accounts balanced. Soldiers got rations on time. Canals received crews before flood season. Discontent found fewer listeners when wages arrived predictably. West as well, the king's seal traveled faster than his chariots. Traders pushed into steppe and desert, following routes Sargon had burned open. In the far Indus, at Harappa, an Akkadian seal would one day surface, the ghost of a handshake between worlds that never met in person. Where armies falter, contracts endure. For a while the realm inhaled. Festivals filled the courtyards. Ishtar's statue gleamed with new gold leaf. Enlil's priests lifted hymns without glancing over their shoulders. In workshops along the river, bronze hissed into molds, while boys learned to press clean wedges into wet clay. After Rimish's winter, this felt like spring. Then palace corridors darkened again. The second conspiracy flowered in whispers. Servants promised advancement. Eunuchs promised silence. A chamberlain promised everything. On a night with no moon, knives folded a king where he slept. The repetition felt ritualistic. History as a pattern the gods refused to break. In the blood-slicked courtyard at dawn, conspirators hung from gate beams, while the kitchen fires were stoked for purifications. Scribes noted the names. Priests pronounced the sin. Soldiers went about tightening straps and checking buckles. Routine returned with terrifying ease, as if the machine had learned to repair itself. A child took the throne, Naram Sin, Manishtushu's son. Regents stood behind the lattice. Generals discovered how comfortable chairs could be. Governors, tasting independence, let reports travel slower. Some left lines out. An empire that had once looked like a spearhead now resembled a net. Resilient, yes, but full of hands pulling in opposite directions. What remained from the brothers mattered. Rimush bequeathed a habit of swift punishment and the memory of walls that fell when loyalty wavered. Manishtushu left a template, estates that bound elites to the center, trade that made peace pay, writing that turned will into contracts. Between massacre and market lay a survivable state. People in the provinces learned the difference less by philosophy than by weight. Under Rymush, tax was a threat. Under Manishtushu, tax was a schedule. Grain moved either way, but one emptied a granary in fear and the other in expectation. In irrigation ditches, men still broke calluses on clay clods. In shrines, women still burned dates for the gods. What altered was the temperature of daily life. Scribes later found a line among the account tablets of Adab. The king's word is the river's current. Stand against it, and the mud will swallow. A proverb rather than a law, but law begins that way. Custom hardened by repetition, justice imagined as something other than a mood. Akkad did not invent fairness, yet it made fairness legible, and legibility is power. 7 days of mourning closed Manishtushu's story. Beer for Enki seeped into cracked earth. Incense rose for Ishtar. A statue joined those of Sargon and Remush in the Hall of Ancestors. Founder, scourge, purchaser. 3 angles of sovereignty stared down at officials who had learned to bow in different ways. Over these ceremonies hung a fatigue that festivals could not dispel. Men muttered that the gods were tired of being managed, that Enlil preferred kings who begged rather than commanded. In taverns, old soldiers spoke of Sargon the Great and compared every successor to a sun that would not rise. Meanwhile, behind latticework, the boy king watched. Uncles murdered, father bled, courtiers smiling with wet eyes. Somewhere in that small, still face, an audacity was forming. Rimush had used fear. Manishtushu had used silver. Naram Sin would reach for something larger, something that could not be bought or beaten, a crown with horns. Before that leap, one lesson remained from this chapter of survival. Power in Akkad no longer flowed from a single charisma. It circulated through estates, through garrisons, through tablets tied with bitumen string. The state had become a system that could endure a bad season, even a bad king, so long as roads held and scribes kept counting. Sunset over the river threw copper light across Akkad's quay. Barges bumped, ropes creaked, gulls squabbled. Somewhere in the palace, a boy rehearsed the posture of a god before a mirror of polished stone, while, out in the districts, a tax agent measured barley against a standard basket, and a veteran turned the first furrow on the land he now owned by royal purchase. Blood had bought time. Bronze and ink had bought structure. Out of both, a new kind of peril approached. The moment when a ruler decides that human titles are too small for what he intends. The boy who became Naram Sin. The great grew up in a palace that smelled of oil lamps and fear. His father, Manishtushu, had been murdered in those corridors, his uncles before him. Servants bowed low when he passed, but their eyes watched doorways instead of his face. Even as a child, he learned that kingship in Akkad was not inheritance. It was survival. By the time he reached manhood, the empire was restless. Governors in Kish and Uruk sent tribute late. The priests of Nippur murmured against the royal line. From east and west, vassals tested their chains. The scribes called it simply the Great Revolt. But the tablets record 9 kings rising at once, 9 armies moving like storm fronts across the land. At their head marched Ifur Kish of Kish, claiming descent from Sumer's ancient lords. From the south came Omargirid of Uruk, carrying the banners of the moon, god Nana. Even Nippur, heart of religion, joined the rebellion under Enlil Nizu, who declared that the gods themselves had withdrawn their favor from Akkad. When Naram Sin took the field, He was not yet divine, only desperate. His first campaigns were fought not for glory, but for existence. Battles flared and died across the plain, skirmishes in the reeds near Adab, ambushes along the Tigris, sieges broken by the sound of horns. For a year, the empire bled. At last, the armies met at what the chronicles call the Great Gate of Enlil, a city's northern approach, lined with ziggurat shadows. There, Naram-Sin gathered the remnants of his father's veterans and the new levies of Akkad. Dust rose like incense, the air throbbed with drums. By sunset, the rebellion was broken. 12,000 prisoners were taken, their chains glinting red in the dying light. Victory made him a legend. The scribes carved his triumph into diorite, the victory stele of Naram-Sin, a masterpiece of arrogance. It shows the king ascending a mountain, trampling enemies as he climbs, his soldiers following in spirals of motion. Above him, stars blaze, symbols of the gods, and on his head rests the horned crown, a headdress once reserved only for divine beings. That crown changed everything. No ruler before had dared to wear it. Sargon had called himself chosen. Naram-Sin called himself divine. In his inscriptions, he appears as Dingir Nara-Am-Sin, the god Naram-Sin, mighty one of Akkad. The priests of Ishtar and Enlil were horrified, but the army rejoiced. For soldiers who had watched dynasties rise and die, a god who could fight beside them was comfort enough. The coronation that followed was unlike any before it. In the temple courtyard of Akkad, torches flared as priests poured oil over his head and chanted hymns written in both Sumerian and Akkadian. "He is not the son of a man," they intoned. "He is the storm given flesh." Offerings of grain and wine were laid before his image, and for the first time in Mesopotamian history, a living man received prayer. Divinity brought ambition. Naram-Sin rebuilt what revolt had broken. He restored the Akur temple at Nippur, its bricks stamped with his name in both tongues, so that even his critics would pray beneath his shadow. He strengthened the garrisons at the empire's edges and expanded the palace at Tel Brak, covering 10 hectares of land with halls of red plaster and cedar beams. Along the northern frontier, he raised fortresses that watched the passes like sentinels of stone. The empire's administration grew as intricate as its temples. Scribes introduced standardized bricks, 32 by 16 by 8 centimeters, each marked with the royal seal, so every wall across Akkad rose to the same measure. In workshops, artisans cast bronze on an industrial scale. The army carried bows strung with sinew from mountain deer, spears with copper points traded from Elam, and shields of hide stretched on frames of cedar. Organization itself became sacred, a reflection of the God King's perfect order. But beyond the order lay hunger, for expansion, for affirmation. Naram-Sin marched north toward the mountains of the Lullaby, tribes who raided the borderlands and laughed at his decrees. The campaign lasted months. In the high passes, snow blinded the soldiers. In the valleys, arrows hissed from behind rocks. When the battle turned, the Lullaby king Satuni was captured alive, dragged before the conqueror as the storm broke overhead. On the stele, Satuni kneels in terror, his hand raised in futile prayer. Naram-Sin towers above him, spear raised, already half a myth. His triumphs carried him farther still, to the sources of the Tigris and Euphrates, and west again, toward the ruins of Ebla, which he burned for the second time. Trade routes reopened under Akkadian banners, and caravans once more crossed the deserts laden with tin, silver, and cedar. From the coasts to the mountains, the world spoke in the language of Akkad. The king's divine status reshaped daily life. Temples to his cult rose beside those of the old gods. In Akkad, priests offered incense to the god Naram-Sin as they once had to Ishtar or Enlil. His statue stood in the same sanctuaries, a mortal form given eternal place. The boundaries between worship and obedience dissolved. To rebel against the king became to blaspheme, yet divinity carries its own peril. The chronicles begin, around this time, to speak of strange signs in the sky. A comet burned for 3 nights over the western desert. Crops withered in the north. The rains that once came with clockwork precision began to falter. In the city of Tel Leilan, the archives end abruptly, abandoned tablets still wet when found millennia later. The land itself was changing. Modern scholars would call it the 4.2 kilo-year event, a climate shift that dried the plains and turned fields to dust. To Naram-Sin and his priests, it could only mean one thing. The gods were angry. The irony was cruel. He had become a god, yet could not control the heavens. The king answered in the only language he knew. He ordered new canals dug to chase the retreating rivers, and when that failed, he raised fresh armies to secure grain from the south. The people murmured that their divine ruler had lost favor. The priests of Nippur whispered that Enlil was punishing his arrogance. Still, the god-king refused to bow. His inscriptions from this period are defiant. Because I am Naram-Sin, mighty one of Akkad, no foe shall stand. But the tone has changed. The confidence of Sargon's grandson is tinged with desperation. He had conquered men and mountains. How could he fight the sky? In the cities, famine followed drought. Markets emptied, and grain that once bought a flock now purchased a single measure. Families fled north, abandoning homes built on parched canals. To keep order, Naram-Sin stationed troops in the streets, their armor glinting while the people starved. Yet the empire did not collapse. Not yet. Its bureaucracy endured, stone tablets counting shortages as precisely as victories. The same efficiency that had once fueled its growth now preserved its carcass, writing records of decline in perfect script. Even as crops failed, the cult of Naram-Sin reached its zenith. His temples blazed with torches. His image wore robes sewn with gold thread. Pilgrims came from cities that had never seen his armies, bringing offerings to the god who had walked as a man. Worship, after all, costs less than bread. In his final years, he was both omnipotent and besieged, a god surrounded by dust. The stelae that once proclaimed triumphs now seemed memorials. Each victory carved in stone only deepened the distance between the living king and the dying world. When Naram-Sin looked from the walls of Akkad, he saw not rebellion or invasion, but emptiness. The rivers shrinking into their beds, the horizon blurred by sand. The empire he had raised to heaven stood at the edge of the earth's endurance. He would die still calling himself divine, but his death opened the gates to something darker. Famine, invasion, and the collapse of everything the dynasty had built. For all his arrogance, Naram-Sin was not wrong in one belief: that power, once claimed by men, would never again belong solely to the gods. Wind swept across the plains of Akkad, carrying the smell of dust and hunger. Fields that once shimmered with barley now crackled underfoot, their canals choked with silt. In the cities, the granaries stood locked, guarded by soldiers whose armor gleamed brighter than the eyes of the starving. The empire that had fed half the world could no longer feed itself. For decades, the god-king, Naram-Sin, had ruled by faith in his own divinity. But faith could not fill empty bellies. The rain failed, then the rivers. Whole villages left their homes and wandered south toward the marshes, following the ghosts of the Euphrates. The scribes in Akkad recorded the change without poetry. The fields yielded nothing. The yield of grain fell by half. The people ate what they could find. Beyond the horizon, mountain tribes watched and waited. The Gutians, nomads from the Zagros, came first, thin men with wild hair and strange tongues. They moved like smoke, plundering border towns, vanishing before the army could reach them. From the north, the Hurrians pressed down. From the west, Amorites crossed the desert with their herds. What had been an empire of boundaries became a map of fires. In this chaos, an event occurred that later ages would remember as divine judgment, the Nippur incident. The priests of Enlil, long uneasy with Naram Sin's claim to godhood, accused the king of sacrilege. Some said he had stripped the temple of its treasures to pay his soldiers. Others that he had simply demanded too much gold for too many wars. The details blurred, but the act itself was unforgivable. The high priest cursed him in the name of Enlil. Soon after, the temple of Nippur was destroyed. Whether by the king's troops or by rioters, no one could tell. To the people, it did not matter. They saw only smoke rising from the house of the chief god, and with it, the last thread of legitimacy burning away. A century later, poets would shape that memory into a story called The Curse of Akkad. In it, the gods turn against the empire they had once blessed. Enlil, enraged by Naram Sin's arrogance, calls a council of heaven. One by one, the deities withdraw their favor. May your canal boats grow nothing but weeds, they decree. May your roads sprout thorns. May wolves prowl your festivals and foxes guard your granaries. The language is ritual, but the ruin it describes was real. The text ends with the king prostrating himself before Enlil, begging forgiveness. I built temples, he cries. I raised statues to your name. But no answer comes. When the poem was written, long after the fall, it served as both lament and warning. Pride brings famine. Impiety brings extinction. Archaeologists would one day confirm what the poets only intuited. Around 2200 BC, the 4.2 kilo-year drought reached its peak. Ice cores from Greenland record a dust veil. Sediments in the Tigris show decades of aridity. At Tel Leilan, the layers of abandonment are thick with wind-blown sand. At Tel Brak, a palace built by Naram Sin lies burned to its foundations. In the south, the rivers shifted again, turning farmland to marsh and marsh to desert. Refugees poured into the cities, begging for grain. Prices soared until a single shekel of silver bought half a sila of barley, a day's meal for one. In Akkad, merchants locked their warehouses. The poor tore them open. Tablets from this time grow terse, panicked, and then cease altogether. Bureaucracy can survive war, but not starvation. Into this vacuum rode the Gutians. No one quite knew where they came from. Mountain pastures, perhaps, or the uplands of Luristan, but they arrived in waves, driving herds before them. To later Sumerians, they were monsters, people who knew no inhibition, who possessed human faces but canine intelligence. That insult, written centuries later, hides a truth. The Gutians were not destroyers by choice, but scavengers of a dying empire. Still, they learned quickly how to rule by plunder. They demanded tribute from surviving cities, stripped statues of their gold, and moved on. Akkad, once the beating heart of civilization, became a camp of ghosts, its streets filled with broken tablets and weeds. Some say the Gutians occupied it, others that even they avoided the cursed place. Southward, Sumer endured, but barely. The old cities of Ur, Uruk, and Lagash tried to govern themselves, their priests reasserting the ancient rites, but without the empire's network of canals and roads, isolation set in. Trade with the Gulf collapsed. Tin from the east no longer reached the smiths. Bronze became scarce. Farmers returned to stone tools and prayer. Naram Sin himself vanished into myth. The late tablets mention only that he fought the Gutians, perhaps even defeated them once, before dying in battle. Some say he was buried beneath the ruins of Akkad, his tomb sealed by the sandstorm that ended his world. Others insist he still walked the earth, punished by the gods to wander as a ghost. Whatever the truth, his death marked the end of Sargon's line. In the years that followed, the empire dissolved like salt in rainwater. Governors declared independence, priests rewrote history, and each city returned to its god. But the memory of unity lingered, haunting those who had tasted it. Even as the fields failed, scribes kept copying the old royal inscriptions, as if words could preserve what the rivers had erased. A century after Naram Sin, an unknown poet wrote another lament. Once there was abundance, it begins. The fish of the river filled the nets. The grain stood tall, and the fields sang to the plough. But the gods turned their faces away. The wind blew, and no one remembered the sound of laughter. The empire's last defenders clung to stone fortresses along the northern frontier, fighting skirmishes that history would forget. A generation later, even those garrisons fell silent. The kings of Akkad had once believed that time itself could be conquered. Now time avenged itself with silence. When the archaeologists of the modern world began to dig, they found more absences than artifacts. Akkad, the capital of the world's first empire, left no certain trace. Its name survived only on broken tablets, a ghost of a city whose stones had vanished. The fall of Akkad became the first remembered collapse in human history, and though the poets called it divine punishment, the deeper truth was simpler. A system stretched beyond its means. The canals that once joined rivers had oversalted the soil. The forests cut for ships had stripped the hills. The climate turned, and no god could make it rain again. In that sense, the curse was real enough. It was not Enlil's wrath, but the planet's indifference that brought the empire to its knees. The people who had invented empire had also invented its consequence. Centuries later, when Sumer rose again under new kings, they would tell the story differently. In their version, the gods punished arrogance and rewarded humility. Yet the ruins said otherwise. Power, like grain, grows tall only once before the land must rest. So ended the house of Sargon, the first to rule the four quarters, the first to fall by its own weight. What remained were fragments, hymns, ledgers, curses, and the memory of a city that thought itself immortal. In the silence after empire, even the wind seemed to carry a warning. The crown that once blazed with divinity now sat on a mortal head. Shah Kalishari, grandson of Sargon the Great, inherited what was left of empire, a husk held together by habit and memory. His name meant king of all kings, a promise or perhaps a plea. When he took the throne around 2217 BC, the land was already cracked and trembling. The rivers wandered from their courses. The fields yielded dust. Behind the palace walls, famine whispered like a ghost that refused to leave. He came to power young, too young for an empire in ruins. The court divided itself around him, priests seeking revenge for Naram Sin's blasphemy, generals defending provinces already lost, scribes rewriting prayers to flatter whichever faction paid them. Beyond Akkad's walls, The Gutians raided from the hills, and Amorite tribes pressed from the west. The gods, the people said, had turned their faces away. Shah Khalishari began as a reformer. His first decrees promised ration relief, temple rebuilding, the restoration of Enlil's favor. But the grain stores were empty, the canals half dry, and the scribes who once kept perfect records now wrote with trembling hands on reused clay. The bureaucracy that had made Akkad great had become its burden. Officials demanded taxes the people could not pay. Soldiers demanded wages the treasury could not fill. When the Gutians came down from the mountains, they found an empire already hollow. Still, Shah Khalishari fought. His tablets speak of a victory at Mount Basar, where the Gutian king, Sharlag, was captured and executed. The triumph was genuine but brief. No sooner had he returned to Akkad than another front ignited in the west. The Amorites, pastoral tribes from the Syrian steppes, began to pour across the Euphrates, driving their herds into the abandoned farmlands. They came not as conquerors, but as settlers, filling the spaces famine had emptied. The Akkadian army met them near the river, where the land was too wide to defend. The chronicles call it the Battle of Basar, different from the mountain victory, but echoing its name like a cruel joke. The Amorites could not be destroyed because they had nothing to lose. In the east, Elam rose again. Its ruler, Puzur-in Shushinak, who had once served as a loyal governor under Naram Sin, declared himself king in his own right. He took Susa, burned the Akkadian garrisons, and carved inscriptions in Elamite rather than Akkadian, a declaration of independence in stone. For the first time in half a century, the empire's eastern frontier ceased to exist. Each campaign drained the center. The army that had once conquered from the Gulf to the Mediterranean now defended fragments of territory like a man trying to hold water in his hands. The Gutians struck again and again. Akkad won battles, lost others, and bled either way. Meanwhile, the economy collapsed. From Ummah, one of the last cities still keeping archives, come the starkest numbers. Grain that once sold for a single shekel now cost 300. The workforce recorded on the temple rolls fell by 3/4. Whole fields were abandoned. Clay tablets show scribes noting the decline in the same neat handwriting they once used to record glory. One field, no yield. Laborers fled. Metal ran short. The bronze workshops melted down old statues for tools and weapons. Temples stripped their altars of ornament to buy food. Trade with Magan and Meluha, the far lands that had once filled Akkad's ports with copper and lapis, disappeared entirely. The ships were gone. The seas were empty. In the palace, the young king's decrees grew desperate. He fixed grain prices, ordered new canals dug, and sent emissaries to the temples begging for divine forgiveness. The gods, silent, did not reply. The priests of Enlil said the drought was punishment for Naram-Sin's hubris. The priests of Ishtar insisted it was simply the turning of fate. Shah Khalishari prayed to both, hoping one would listen. For a moment, it seemed as if the old magic might return. In his 10th year, the rains came early. The river swelled, and crops sprouted in the silted fields. The city held its first festival of plenty in a generation. Musicians played the old hymns of Sargon's age, though few remembered the words. The people cheered their king as he paraded through the streets in a chariot of gilded wood. But the illusion could not hold. Flood followed drought, washing away the fragile harvest. Disease spread in the camps. The soldiers' pay stopped, and riots broke out in the capital. A palace official recorded the chaos in a single line before his stylus broke. The people cry out for bread. The gods are deaf. In his 24th year, the last dated tablet of Shah Kalishari's reign, the bureaucracy simply stops. No new records, no temple repairs, no shipments from the provinces. The network of scribes that had once connected empire to throne dissolved like clay in rainwater. Governors declared themselves independent. City-states raised their old banners. Even the weight standards, so carefully unified under Sargon, splintered back into local measures. Akkad was no longer one realm, but a memory recited by starving men. No one knows exactly how Shah Kalishari died. Some say he fell in battle against the Gutians, others that he was murdered in a palace conspiracy, betrayed by his own officers. The Sumerian king list, written generations later, remembers only the aftermath. Then came confusion. Who was king? Who was not king? In that confusion, 4 claimants rose within 3 years. Igigi, Nanum, Imi, and Elulu, names like sparks from a dying fire, each burning briefly, each forgotten. None ruled long enough to mint coins or raise temples. They were shadows fighting over a crown that had already turned to dust. Outside the capital, the world changed shape. The Gutians moved freely across the north, extorting tribute from cities that could no longer resist. Trade ceased. Knowledge retreated into a handful of surviving schools. The languages of power, Sumerian and Akkadian, fractured into dialects. What had once been the center of civilization became a patchwork of ruins and tribes. Shah Kalishari's reign ended not with a fall, but with an unraveling. There was no single catastrophe, no sack of Akkad to mark the date. The empire simply thinned out until nothing held it together but legend. In later centuries, poets would remember him kindly. The king who fought when fighting meant nothing, who tried to rebuild a world already dying. They said he prayed to every god and received no answer, that he stood on the walls of his fading capital and watched the horizon burn with the camps of his enemies. When the dawn came, the smoke looked like mountains, and he believed for a moment that the gods had returned. But the light was only fire. The age of empire was over. The age of scavengers had begun. Morning broke over a country that no longer remembered its name. Where the canals of Akkad once gleamed, reeds had reclaimed the mud. Where kings had stood, herds now wandered through temple ruins. For nearly a century after Shah Kalishari, Mesopotamia drifted without a center. The scribes who survived called it the Gutian interregnum, but to those who lived through it, it was simply the time when order forgot to return. The Gutians came from the Zagros Mountains, shepherds turned marauders, moving in restless bands that followed the line of the Tigris southward. They left few records and built no cities. Their kings, if kings they were, ruled like passing seasons, here for a harvest, gone by winter. Later generations would claim there were 21 Gutian rulers over 91 years, though most reigned barely long enough to be named. Contemporaries saw them as a plague, but they were only symptoms of a world already exhausted. The Gutians plundered what remained, demanded tribute, and left. They kept no archives, minted no seals, carved no monuments. They were the silence between civilizations. In the north, the cities of the Assyrian plain withered. Assur, once a trading town on the frontier, shrank to a cluster of huts huddled beneath its ancient ziggurat. Nineveh fell silent. Even Akkad, the empire's vanished heart, became a myth. No one could agree where it had stood. Somewhere near Kish, others said, or near Babylon's future dust. The wind erased what the conquerors could not. To the south, Sumer endured, wounded but breathing. The canals of Uruk, Ur, and Lagash still ran, though barely. The cities retreated into themselves, each ruled by local governors who called themselves kings, but behaved like caretakers. Trade across the Gulf flickered back to life. Fishermen and merchants sailed to Dilmun and Magan, swapping dates for copper, barley for wood. Amid decay, small economies of persistence emerged. From this dim age, one figure stands out like a candle in a tomb. Gudea of Lagash. His city lay in the shadow of ruins, yet he rebuilt it, stone by stone. While the Gutians ruled elsewhere, Gudea raised temples, dug canals, and cast his own image in diorite so hard that even time could not bruise it. 20 statues of him survive, seated, calm, hands clasped, eyes lifted towards something unseen. On his robes are written the plans of temples and the prayers of his people. May the brickwork of Ningirsu shine like the sun, one inscription reads. In an age that forgot beauty, Gudea remembered it stubbornly. He restored the temple of Aninu, dedicated to Ningirsu, the warrior god of Lagash, and filled it with treasures from distant lands. Ships from the Gulf brought cedar from Lebanon, gold from Anatolia, lapis from Afghanistan. How he maintained those connections in a time of collapse remains a mystery, but his own cylinders, massive clay scrolls inscribed with hymns, tell of dreams in which the gods themselves gave him blueprints. In Gudea's Lagash, art and devotion became acts of resistance. While other cities decayed, his shone for a brief moment as a pocket of order, proof that civilization could be rebuilt by will alone. Yet his realm was small, a candle against the storm. Beyond the southern marshes, the world was changing again. The fields of Akkad had grown white with salt from centuries of irrigation. Farmers abandoned them for pastures in the north, where rainfall was still kind. Nomadic groups, Amorites from the west, Hurrians from the foothills, moved into the vacuum. They brought herds, tents, and languages that sounded strange to Sumerian ears. The shift from plough to pasture, from settled field to wandering camp, reshaped the map more thoroughly than war. The scribes, few and fearful, continued to write laments in the old style. One fragment from Ur reads, "No barley, no fish, no wool. The priest takes what little is left. The child cries. The mother has no milk." The wind alone answers another, written perhaps in Lagash, adds, "The Gutian knows no law. He does not learn speech. His words are a storm." Such laments turned the Gutians into mythic villains, beasts without intellect or piety. In truth, they were neither worse nor better than the desperate peoples around them. They raided because they must, taxed because they could, and moved on when the land yielded nothing more. The idea of empire had vanished. What remained were transactions of survival. Archaeology confirms the scale of the retreat. Settlements in northern Mesopotamia dropped by 2/3. In the south, habitation contracted to the river mouths, where irrigation was still possible. The middle Tigris, once the highway of Sargon's armies, turned to scrubland and dust. The age of cities gave way to an age of villages, and history narrowed its focus to those few who still had clay to write on. In the fragments of this silence, a new pattern began to form. The Gutians, incapable of administration, often left local elites in charge of the cities they nominally ruled. Those administrators kept the old bureaucracies alive, counting grain, assigning labor, maintaining what canals they could. Slowly, through habit more than design, the machinery of Sumerian civilization began to turn again. The Gutian kings themselves appear as shadows in the Sumerian king list, names without deeds: Inkishush, Imta, Sarlagab, Tirigan. Their reigns blur into one another until the last, Tirigan, who ruled for 40 days before being overthrown. The brevity feels symbolic, tyranny undone by its own inertia. While the Gutians faded, Suma's spirit recovered its voice. In Uruk, poets wrote new hymns to the sun god Utu, who sees all things and restores justice. In Ur, craftsmen rebuilt ziggurats and reforged the cults of Nana and Ningal. The people looked not backward to Akkad's empire, but inward to their own traditions, to the steady rhythm of ritual and flood. By 2144 BC, a generation after Gudea's death, Sumer was ready for rebirth. In Uruk, a general named Utu Hegel gathered an army and declared that the gods had commanded him to drive the Gutians back to the mountains. His inscription, found centuries later on a broken tablet, reads, "The great dragon rose from the river and struck the fanged serpent of the mountains." The poetry was his own, but the victory was real. He caught Tirigan, the last Gutian ruler, as he fled north and paraded him through Uruk in chains. The crowd hailed their liberator. The temples rang with drums. After nearly a century of darkness, the south had a king again, and the word Suma meant something more than ruin. The Gutians vanished into history's blind spot. Some settled in the hills, others vanished entirely. What remained of their brief dominion were broken tablets, ruined fields, and a memory sharpened by resentment. Later scribes would call their era the years when barley did not grow. In truth, those years had also taught endurance. Sumer had learned how to die and still remember itself. The canals could silt, the palaces fall, but the words pressed into clay endured, waiting for hands that could read them again. When Utu Hegal's banners rose over Uruk, the people said the curse had lifted, the gods had returned. In the temples, the old hymns were sung once more, and the scribes opened their boxes of styluses, ready to write a new history. Still, even they knew how fragile renewal could be. Behind every celebration lay the echo of collapse. In the space between two floods, civilization had vanished once already. It could vanish again. For the moment, though, the rivers ran full. The fields were green, and the wind carried not dust, but the scent of new barley. The long night of the Gutians was over. At first light, the banners of Uruk unfurled above the river. They were crimson with dust, but they rose nonetheless. After nearly a century of silence, a king's voice echoed through the city again. Utu Hegel, who called himself the Great Dragon, had come to claim what the Gutians had stolen. He rode at the head of a ragged army, farmers with bronze sickles, priests carrying the emblems of their gods, a handful of veterans too old for war but unwilling to die in submission. They crossed the bridges of baked brick, singing the old hymns to Utu, the sun god who brings justice, their voices thin but fierce. News spread faster than his soldiers could march. Cities that had lived like hermits, Lagash, Nippur, sent messengers bearing barley and prayers. For the first time since Sargon's age, the southern plains spoke with one purpose. Even the canals, long neglected, seemed to run clearer. At the river's northern bend, Utu Hegal met Tirigan, the last king of the Gutians. The battle was brief and final. Tirigan fled with his family toward the mountains, but the people of Dabrum, tired of tribute and hunger, seized him and delivered him to Utu Hegel's camp. The conqueror refused ransom. The Gutian was paraded through Uruk in chains, his hair tangled, his eyes wide with disbelief. The victory was proclaimed in every temple. The fanged serpent has been broken, the dragon of Sumer has triumphed. Scribes pressed the words into clay with a reverence usually reserved for gods. For the first time in generations, the archives of Sumer spoke not of famine or rebellion, but of deliverance. Utu-Hegel reigned for 7 years. They were years of restoration rather than conquest. Temples reopened, canals were dredged. The priests of Enlil returned to Nippur to offer sacrifices once more. The walls of Uruk, rebuilt stone by stone, shone in the sunlight. Yet the prosperity was young, fragile, and fleeting. In his 8th year, while inspecting a dam, Utu-Hegel's chariot overturned, and he drowned in the river he had restored. His people mourned him as the man who had begun again but could not finish. Out of his shadow stepped Ur-Nammu, governor of Ur, and some said, the dead king's son-in-law. Where Utu-Hegel had ruled by charisma, Ur-Nammu ruled by discipline. He understood that Suma's salvation would come not from battle, but from structure, from rebuilding the very idea of the state. His rise was careful, almost silent. Within a year of Utu-Hegel's death, Ur-Nammu's name appeared on official tablets as King of Ur, King of Sumer and Akkad. The title itself was an act of resurrection, binding together the memory of Sargon's empire with the faith of Sumer. He began with water. Crews of laborers, organized by temple districts, cleared the clogged canals and rebuilt the embankments. The rivers, once again, obeyed human command. With irrigation restored, the barley returned. The scent of wet silt filled the air, an ancient perfume of renewal. Next came the temples. Ur-Nammu ordered the reconstruction of Ikishnugal, the great sanctuary of the moon god Nana, and at its heart raised a monument that would outlive every dynasty, the great ziggurat of Ur. Its base measured 62 meters across, its height nearly 30, its bricks inscribed with the king's name. From its summit, priests watched the stars and proclaimed that the gods had forgiven Sumer. Unlike the palaces of Akkad, built to awe, Ur-Nammu's city was designed to endure. Streets followed strict grids. Workshops were grouped by trade. Archives multiplied. Where Naram-Sin had sought heaven, Ur-Nammu sought order. He gave that order voice in the earliest surviving code of laws. The Code of Ur-Nammu, carved into tablets around 2100 BC, predates Hammurabi by 3 centuries. Its tone is not vengeance, but fairness. If a man commits murder, he shall be killed, it declares. But for most crimes, fines replace mutilation. If a man's tooth breaks another man's tooth, he shall weigh out 1/3 of a mina of silver. The laws protect widows, orphans, and the poor. They forbid priests from taking grain unjustly. For the first time, justice was written in the language of mercy. Behind this vision stood a new administration. From the storage city of Drehem, 20 miles from Ur, archaeologists have unearthed over 30,000 tablets, records of livestock, taxes, temple offerings, and labor rotations. The bureaucratic heartbeat of empire throbbed once again, but this time under the seal of Sumerian revival rather than Akkadian conquest. The system was called Balagar, meaning rotation. Each province took turns supplying the court with goods and labor, ensuring that no single region bore the full weight of tribute. It was a masterpiece of fairness disguised as devotion, and it bound the cities together without need for armies. Ur-Nammu also understood the power of story. He ordered that the Sumerian king list, the great chronicle of rulers, be revised. In the new version, Akkad's age became a divine experiment, an empire granted and withdrawn by the gods. The kings of Ur were portrayed as chosen to restore balance. History was edited into legitimacy. Under his rule, Sumer entered its last golden dawn. Trade revived with Dilmun, Magan, and the East. Bronze flowed again through the workshops. Lapis and carnelian returned to the jewelers' benches. Temples hummed with song. A generation that had grown up on famine tasted plenty for the first time. At dusk, the king would climb the ziggurat stairways and watch the moon rise over the marshes. Below him, the city glowed with torchlight, its people working, trading, praying. To them, he must have seemed like a new Sargon, but gentler, a ruler who built instead of burned. Still, even in this rebirth, the memory of collapse lingered. Every canal that flowed could still dry. Every temple rebuilt could still burn. The scribes who recorded Ur-Nammu's deeds did so with the weary knowledge of those who had already seen the world end once. Their tablets, though full of praise, carry an undertone of pleading. Let this order last. Ur-Nammu died in battle, perhaps in the north, struck down while defending the peace he had restored. His son Shulgi would inherit the throne and raise Sumer to its greatest prosperity. But the seeds of decline already slept beneath the soil. For now, though, the rivers ran true. The gods smiled from their shrines, and the night sky above Ur shimmered with faith renewed. The ziggurat stood like a ladder between earth and heaven, a promise that civilization could be rebuilt even from ash. And if the empire's first birth had been forged in conquest, its second was born of memory. The stubborn will of a people who refused to forget that they had once commanded the world. In the schools of Ur, young scribes sat cross-legged on the floor, shaping soft clay into squares. The air was thick with the smell of mud and oil lamps. Masters paced among them, reed styluses in hand, calling out words for the students to copy. Lugal, the teacher said. King. The students echoed him. Sharam, he corrected, the Akkadian form. 2 words for the same power, one old, one new, and between them stretched the story of a civilization that refused to die. Centuries had passed since the fall of Akkad, yet its language endured. Akkadian, born from the traders of Kish and perfected in the courts of Sargon and Naram-Sin, had become the shared tongue of empire. The kings of Ur III, though proud of their Sumerian heritage, ruled in 2 voices. Sumerian belonged to the gods and the temples. Akkadian belonged to the laws, the taxes, and the soldiers who kept the peace. In the bustling courtyards of Ur, scribes recorded the daily rhythm of a working world. Orders traveled through the BALA system, the network of tribute and labor that bound the provinces to the throne. Each city took its turn, providing what the court required. Barley from Umma, cattle from Lagash, wool from Adab, copper from Uruk. In the distribution center of Drehem, clerks read the shipments aloud, their voices steady and rhythmic, as if reciting a prayer. Language and administration had become inseparable. A single letter, written in Akkadian, could travel from the Gulf to the northern plains without need for translation. Sumer, once divided by dialect and rivalry, now spoke a language of record and order. The empire's unity no longer depended on conquest, but on communication. Beyond the palace, words carried memory. Sumerian hymns and myths were copied line by line into Akkadian, each phrase translated, preserved, and renewed. What had once been the property of a single city or cult became part of a collective heritage. In these bilingual tablets, scribes found themselves walking through 2 worlds at once, the mythic past of Sumer and the living present of Akkad. By around 2,000 years before Christ, Akkadian had begun to branch like a river. To the north, merchants from Assur carried it to Anatolia, where their tablets, buried beneath the ruins of Kultepe, would later reveal letters of trade and affection, requests for tin, silver, and safe journeys. To the west, in Mari, Kings and diplomats exchanged Akkadian correspondence as a language of negotiation. More than 20,000 tablets survive from that city alone, the chatter of politics preserved in clay. Even the legends of Sargon and Naram Sin returned in new voices. Stories such as the King of Battle retold Sargon's march into foreign lands, while the Akkadian legend turned Naram Sin's hubris into cautionary myth. Over centuries, history softened into parable, and parable hardened into tradition. The empire lived on, reshaped by storytellers who never saw its walls. In the temples, scholars began to write dictionaries. Long lists paired Sumerian words with their Akkadian meanings, preserving a bridge between languages. Students memorized these lists by candlelight, reciting thousands of terms for barley, wool, cattle, and God. The work was dry, but through it, the past stayed reachable. Sumerian slowly vanished from daily life, yet its spirit remained inked into the minds of those who learned to translate its songs. Sumerian became the tongue of ritual. Priests still sang in it, though few understood the words fully. To pray in Sumerian was to speak as the ancestors had spoken, to approach the gods in their own language. Akkadian, meanwhile, carried the burdens of law, medicine, and astronomy. Every new discovery, every royal order, every grain shipment passed through its syllables. In the libraries of Ur, bilingualism became second nature. Contracts began with a Sumerian invocation, when the gods decreed, and ended with Akkadian precision. He shall pay 2 minas of silver. Even omens and cures appeared in both voices, the priest invoking the divine in one, the healer prescribing in the other. The dual system reflected the civilization itself, one part rooted in devotion, the other in design. As time passed, Akkadian divided into regional dialects. Old Babylonian developed in the south, smooth and formal, suited to law and literature. Old Assyrian thrived in the north, brisk and practical, the language of merchants and caravans. When Hammurabi later inscribed his laws, he chose Akkadian, not Sumerian, as the language of justice, a choice that confirmed the transformation already underway. By then, the script itself had become an empire. Cuneiform signs, the wedge impressions that once recorded grain and tribute, were now used across the Near East. Hittite kings in Anatolia wrote to Egypt in Akkadian. Pharaohs replied in kind. The language of Sargon had become the diplomacy of the world. In Ur's schools, the lessons continued. The scribes knew that they were heirs to more than cities or dynasties. They were keepers of a memory system older than any temple. Their masters reminded them that empires fall, but writing endures. Clay lasts longer than stone, they said. A word lasts longer than a wall. When invaders eventually came again, the Elamites from the east, the Amorites from the west, the walls of Ur fell, but its words survived. The conquerors found the tablets and learned from them. They copied the language of their enemies and made it their own. Akkadian spread because even in defeat it was useful. Through centuries of change, the script carried the pulse of a civilization that refused to be erased. By the second millennium before Christ, it had become the universal medium of power. From mountain citadels to desert palaces, kings dictated in Akkadian, and their scribes pressed the commands into clay. And yet, beneath the surface, something more intimate was happening. Language had turned survival into art. Each wedge pressed by a stylus was an act of defiance against oblivion, a way of saying, we were here, we built, we thought, we dreamed. In a schoolroom in Ur, a teacher inspected a student's work. The boy's hands were slick with clay, his letters crooked but legible. The master smiled. Good, he said, Now, again, the world is written by those who do not stop. Outside, the river murmured through the canals, and the great ziggurat shone in the heat. The empire of Akkad was long gone, but its voice remained, echoing in every sign impressed upon the earth. Long after the last scribe pressed a stylus into clay, the world forgot where Akkad had stood. The names of its kings survived in legend: Sargon, Naram-Sin, the god-kings of the four quarters. But the city itself dissolved into myth. Travelers in later ages spoke of a place swallowed by desert winds or drowned beneath the shifting rivers. For 3,000 years, no one could say whether it had ever been real. The rediscovery began not with a spade, but with curiosity. In the 19th century, when European explorers crossed the plains of Iraq, searching for the ruins of Babylon and Nineveh, they found tablets covered in strange, wedge-shaped signs. Scholars in London and Paris puzzled over them, comparing the marks like detectives reading code. One by one, the signs yielded their sounds. When they reached the word Akkad, the old world stirred again. The tablets spoke of a city so powerful that even its own scribes called it the navel of the world. They described Sargon's palace, its gardens watered by hidden canals, Naram-Sin's temple shining with gold, streets crowded with merchants, soldiers, and priests. But where was it? No ruin carried the name. The Euphrates had changed its course 100 times since the empire's fall, hiding its secrets beneath centuries of silt. Archaeologists searched along the great river's bends. Some believed Akkad lay beneath the mounds of Tel Eder, north of Babylon. Others pointed to Ishan Mizyad, near modern Baghdad. None were certain. Each site offered fragments, inscribed bricks, foundation tablets, broken seals, but never the city itself. Akkad had become the archaeological mirage of Mesopotamia, always near, never found. Yet its ghosts were everywhere. In the ruins of Nineveh, excavators unearthed a bronze head with calm features and a beard plaited like cord. Its eyes had been gouged out in antiquity, as if to blind the past. The craftsmanship was exquisite, cast by lost wax method in the 23rd century before Christ. Many believed it to be the portrait of Sargon himself, the oldest known image of political power. It was not found in Akkad, yet it seemed to look back toward it, as though remembering. Far to the north, near Dohuk, villagers uncovered a heavy copper base inscribed in Akkadian. Sargon, king of the world, dedicated this statue to Ishtar. The statue itself was gone, melted or stolen, but the base survived. It lay buried for 4,000 years until the 1960s, when archaeologists called it the Besetki statue. The metal still shone faintly under the dust, the lettering sharp as if written yesterday. Even in fragments, the empire's confidence remained intact. At Tel Brak, in modern Syria, excavations revealed a vast palace from Naram-Sin's time, halls once painted red and yellow, storerooms filled with administrative tablets, and a destruction layer of ash and charred beams. The city had burned in the same years the empire collapsed. Under the microscope, scientists found grains of dust carried by wind, evidence of the long drought that had emptied the north. What the poets called the curse of the gods was written in the earth itself. The deeper archaeologists dug, the more the ancient record resembled a palimpsest, history written, erased, and rewritten by water and time. Entire cities had shifted with the rivers. The Tigris and Euphrates, once proud highways of empire, had wandered across their own deltas, burying temples and palaces beneath layers of alluvial clay. Finding Akkad meant finding the landscape as it had been 4,000 years earlier, and that too was an act of imagination. Modern science joined where myth had faltered. Satellite imaging traced old riverbeds invisible to the eye. Geologists studied sediments to map the changing floodplains. Each new method drew the circle tighter, but never to the center. Akkad remained hidden, like a word erased from its own sentence. Still, discoveries multiplied. In the archives of Nudzi, fragments of Akkadian administrative texts appeared, contracts and inventories that echoed Sargon's bureaucracy centuries after his empire fell. In museums from Baghdad to Yale, scholars identified cylinder seals engraved with the same royal names once thought legendary. The Baghdad Museum, before its looting in the early 21st century, housed a collection of these relics, delicate carvings of kings before the gods, lines of script recording prayers and oaths. Each one was a small voice from a vanished capital. As archaeology matured, so too did its tools. Chemists used neutron activation analysis to trace the origin of copper and tin in ancient bronze, revealing the trade routes that sustained Akkad's economy. Climate scientists read speleothems, stone growths inside caves, to measure rainfall patterns that aligned perfectly with the empire's collapse. Satellites mapped terrain once crossed by armies and caravans. The more data accumulated, the more Akkad re-emerged, not as a city of fantasy, but as the first experiment in global order. And yet the city itself stayed lost. Excavation after excavation ended in disappointment. Looting and war scarred the landscape. Shifting water tables destroyed what time had spared. The ruins of Ur, Uruk, and Nippur yielded their treasures, but Akkad, mother of empires, remained buried under its own myth. For scholars, that absence became its own fascination. Akkad was no longer a place to be found, but a question to be asked. What happens when the first city of power vanishes so completely that only its language remains? How does memory survive when stone does not? Perhaps that too is part of the lesson. Akkad was the first civilization to understand the power of writing, to know that words could outlast walls. Its kings built monuments, its scribes built permanence. Even when the bricks turned to dust, the tablets carried the story onward, waiting for hands that could read them again. Today, every archaeologist who kneels in the Mesopotamian dust inherits that same faith. Each trench, each fragment of clay, is a conversation with the dead. When they find a name, Sargon, Rimush, Naram-Sin, they do not merely recover history, they return breath to silence. One day, perhaps, the capital will be found. Beneath the fields between Baghdad and Babylon, or under some nameless mound along a dry canal, the city of Akkad may still sleep, its tablets stacked in chambers of darkness. Until then, its presence lingers in every discovery that bears its script. Akkad is not lost, only dispersed. It lives in the seal that once stamped a king's decree, in the statue base that still bears his boast, in the lines of clay that describe the rhythm of tribute and the turning of the BALA system. Its true location may not be a point on a map, but the network of stories that radiated from it, north to the mountains, south to the sea, outward into all that followed. Every empire since has searched for the same thing, a center strong enough to hold the world together. Sargon built his from bricks and courage. The archaeologists of our age build theirs from memory and dust. In the end, Akkad's greatest monument may be its absence. The city that invented permanence proved that even the mightiest power fades. But the desire to remember never does. It begins not in a ruin or a city, but in a library. Somewhere in ancient Babylon, a scribe lifts a clay tablet from a wooden shelf. The text he copies is centuries old, its edges worn smooth from handling. He dips his stylus into wet clay and begins to trace the story again, line after line, name after name. At the top of the tablet, the first word he writes is Naram-Sin. To that scribe, the king was already half legend. The man who had once called himself divine had become a character in the moral imagination of the Near East, a caution, a memory, a riddle. He was no longer simply a ruler of Akkad, but the figure through which later generations argued with the past. The story that survived was not of conquest, but of collapse. The Curse of Akkad, composed long after his death, told how the God King had turned his armies against the sacred city of Nippur, how he had stripped Enlil's temple of its gold, how heaven answered with famine and invasion. The poem ends with the Gutians descending like locusts, while Naram-Sin, abandoned by the gods, watches his empire die. It was never meant as history. It was a parable, written by priests of the restored Sumerian order to explain what could not otherwise be understood, how something as immense as Akkad could fall. Their answer was simple: pride. In their eyes, Naram-Sin had committed the first great sin of civilization, believing that kingship made him divine. Generations of rulers took the warning to heart. The Babylonians recited the story during the New Year festival, a ritual of humility meant to remind the king that even glory must bow. A chorus of priests would chant the lines, "He built the walls, and they became his prison. He raised the temples, and they became his tomb." Each syllable carried centuries of guilt and awe. The tale spread with the language of empire. In omen lists, his name appears beside Sargon's. If a king reigns like Sargon, prosperity will come. If a king acts like Naram-Sin, the land will perish. Every ruler thereafter lived in their shadow, balancing between ambition and blasphemy. As empires rose again, first Babylon, then Assyria, the story followed them like a conscience. Assyrian kings in particular, descendants in spirit if not in blood, could not resist the irony. They despised Naram-Sin's arrogance, yet borrowed his image. Reliefs from Nineveh show kings wearing the horned crown once reserved for gods. To condemn him was to imitate him, a paradox that made the legend immortal. The Assyrian libraries turned that paradox into doctrine. In the archives of Assurbanipal, tablets preserve the many lives of Naram-Sin, the sinner, the warrior, the seeker of forbidden wisdom. One text, the legend of Naram-Sin and the enemy hordes, turns his downfall into an allegory of kingship tested by the unknown. The enemies are not men, but demons, embodiments of chaos. The king defeats them, but the victory brings no peace. The gods still withdraw. The message is clear. No victory is proof of favor. Every triumph is a trial. In the same library, another version, the Akkadian legend, goes further. It portrays Naram-Sin as a tragic figure, condemned to fight endless wars against divine silence. The tone is almost sympathetic. The text does not mock him, it mourns him. The god who had once ruled the world becomes the first man to question the fairness of heaven. By the time of Assurbanipal, more than 1,000 years had passed since Akkad's fall, yet the myth had not lost its heat. The scribes copied the stories not to ridicule their ancestor, but to keep him alive as example and warning. To know Naram-Sin was to understand the boundary between mortal and divine, the line every king was tempted to cross. The fascination reached beyond Mesopotamia. In Hattusa, capital of the Hittite kings, copies of the Akkadian legends were found in translation, their cuneiform and signs reshaped, but their meaning intact. Farther south, in Amarna, fragments of similar tales appear among the Egyptian archives. proof that even pharaohs, who claimed godhood as birthright, recognized the terror in Naram-Sin's defiance. The story had become part of the world's memory, the first universal cautionary tale. But legend has a way of folding back on itself. By the late first millennium before Christ, a countercurrent appeared in Babylonian thought. Some scholars began to see Naram-Sin not as blasphemer, but as visionary. In this retelling, his rebellion was not pride, but courage. A human voice demanding meaning from indifferent gods. The destruction of Akkad became transformation. The scattering of its people a necessary renewal. Out of his fall, civilization spread. This interpretation found subtle expression in royal ideology. Kings who admired his ambition quietly restored his imagery. They invoked his titles, King of the Four Quarters, mighty among the great gods, and modeled their conquests on his campaigns. Naram-Sin's name, once anathematized, became a spell of legitimacy again. Even the horned crown reappeared, not as heresy, but as symbol of rightful dominion. What had begun as condemnation ended as continuity. The memory of his fall became the memory of his endurance. The more distant the event, the more irresistible its symmetry seemed. Every empire saw itself in him. The builder who believed too much, the dreamer who reached too far. Centuries later, when modern excavators unearthed the victory stele of Naram-Sin, the stone seemed to confirm both sides of the myth. The king climbs a mountain, spear raised, his soldiers following like shadows. Above his head, stars glow, the emblems of divinity. The composition is startling, not static, but rising, diagonal, a motion toward heaven. It is both triumph and warning, frozen at the moment when victory and ruin are indistinguishable. No one knows who buried the stele. It was found centuries after his death, carefully reinterred in a temple at Susa, as if those who conquered him still feared his image. They could destroy his city, but not his presence. The god-king who had angered heaven was still too powerful to erase. In that paradox lies the secret of his survival. Naram-Sin became what no mortal can plan to become, a language. His name entered the vocabulary of power, of prophecy, of caution. It lived in every king's proclamation, every priest's sermon, every poet's lament. To speak of empire was to speak of him, whether in admiration or dread. The myth that condemned him also ensured that he would never be forgotten, because what he represented, the hunger for permanence, the reach beyond the mortal, was the engine of history itself. When we read his story now, in the faint wedge marks of tablets baked 4,000 years ago, we hear the same question that haunted those who first wrote it. How far can a man reach before he becomes what he worships? The scribes of Babylon answered it with warnings. The kings of Assyria answered with imitation. Modern readers can only marvel that a single human life became the mirror in which all empires see themselves. The legend of Naram-Sin did not die because the world keeps needing it. Every civilization builds its mountain. Every ruler looks up and imagines the stars waiting for him. When the climb ends, as it always does, the story of Akkad is told again. In the royal courtyard of Babylon, a scribe unrolled a tablet older than the city itself. Its clay was the color of river mud, its wedges pressed by hands long turned to dust. Before reading aloud, he brushed the surface clean and said to his king, Hammurabi, "These are the words of Sargon." For the rulers of the new Babylonian kingdom, Akkad was not a ruin, it was scripture. They saw in Sargon's empire a promise unfulfilled, an idea waiting to be claimed again. The rivers had shifted, the gods had changed names, but the vision endured. One realm under law, stretching from sea to sea. Hammurabi turned memory into policy. His conquests along the Euphrates mirrored Sargon's marches. His scribes recorded them in Akkadian, the same imperial tongue that had once united the world. When he carved his code into black stone, its language was not Sumerian, but Akkadian, the vocabulary of power reborn as justice. The Stele's preface rings like an echo from 2 millennia before. I am the shepherd who brings peace. I am the king who makes righteousness shine. The style, the rhythm, even the confidence belong to Akkad. Yet Babylon's inheritance was not conquest, but codification. Where Sargon ruled by command, Hammurabi ruled by principle. The idea that a king could govern through written law, that order could outlive the body of its ruler, was the final transformation of Akkad's dream. Empire had become administration. Kingship turned to grammar. Far to the north, another people listened to that echo. In Assur, a frontier town on the Tigris, merchants and soldiers built a kingdom that would outlast them all. The Assyrians called their rulers Sharu, the Akkadian word for king, and spoke of their dominion as Matu Sharuti, the land of kingship. Every phrase they used was inherited. Under Shamshi Adad I, Assyria declared itself the heir of Sargon's order. The king rebuilt temples, restored the cult of Ishtar, and carved inscriptions that revived the oldest of royal titles, King of the Universe. The phrase was not arrogance. It was tradition, a declaration that history itself had appointed him. To reign in Mesopotamia was to speak Akkadian, to write in its script, to borrow its symbols of legitimacy. Through Assyria, the legacy hardened into method. The armies marched with Sargon's discipline. Governors administered provinces as Akkadianensis once had. Each victory, each tribute tablet, was a reenactment. The dream of universal empire, born in Akkad's vanished streets, walked again in the iron rhythm of Assyrian boots. By the 8th century before Christ, the continuity became deliberate theatre. Sargon II, rising to power amid rebellion, took the old conqueror's name as armor. If Sargon built the first empire, he declared, I shall restore it. In the northern plain, he raised a new capital, Dur-Sharukin, Fort Sargon, a city planned with mathematical precision, its walls carved with scenes of divine kingship. When the first gate opened, its lintel bore a single inscription. Sargon, king of the 4 quarters, has built this city as Akkad once was. The message was unmistakable. His reign was not imitation, but reincarnation. Even his successors could not escape that gravity. Sennacherib, his son, expanded the empire to the Mediterranean and rebuilt Babylon, only to destroy it later in wrath, a cycle that seemed almost fated. During those years, excavators in his service uncovered an ancient statue base inscribed with Sargon's name. The artifact was treated with reverence, not curiosity. It was reburied in a new shrine, as though returning the relic to its ancestor. The Assyrians had become custodians of Akkad's ghost. In the library of Assurbanipal, the last great Assyrian king, that devotion reached its peak. There, among tens of thousands of tablets, scribes gathered every surviving text in the Akkadian tongue. Laws, hymns, omens, and royal inscriptions copied line for line from sources already 1,000 years old. To preserve the language was to preserve the idea of empire. On winter nights, by the light of oil lamps, Assurbanipal's scholars recited the old chronicles. They spoke the names of Sargon and Naram-Sin as if invoking ancestors. In their hands, the past was both tool and warning, a map of greatness and decline. When later generations uncovered that library, they found not only history, but continuity, the first deliberate attempt to gather the world's knowledge before it could vanish. After Assyria fell, Babylon rose again. Its last king, Nabonidus, was a man of excavations as much as of faith. He sent teams to the deserts and the ruins, ordering them to dig beneath ancient temples until they found the foundation stones of Akkadian kings. One of those stones, carved with the name Naram Sin, was treated as revelation. Nabonidus wrote that the gods had shown him the works of the first empire, so that he might rebuild them in humility. Even at the end of Mesopotamian history, rulers still looked backward for instruction. By Nabonidus's time, the word Akkad had lost its geography and become a metaphor, a shorthand for civilization itself. Scribes wrote Sumer and Akkad to mean all Mesopotamia, from the marshes of the south to the mountains of the north. It was no longer a city, but an axis, divine order balanced with human rule. Even after new conquerors came, the Persians, the Greeks, the echo endured. Cuneiform, Akkad's gift to the world, remained the script of scholarship. Astronomers charted the movements of planets in it. Priests wrote the final hymns to Ishtar in the Old Tongue. By the 1st century after Christ, when the last clay tablet was pressed, a record of a lunar eclipse, the wedges of Akkad closed their long history. What the hands of Sumer and Akkad began, the rest of the world continued. Babylonian laws inspired Assyria's administration. Assyrian bureaucracy shaped Persia's provinces. Persian governors taught Rome how to govern through writing. The empires that followed did not copy Akkad. They became its grammar. When archaeologists at last uncovered the libraries of Nineveh and Babylon, the story came full circle. The script that had defined ancient kingship returned to light under modern eyes. Its words, read again after 3,000 years, still carried the same authority. The conviction that power, to last, must be recorded. That empire begins in the mind of a scribe as much as in the hand of a soldier. On a cracked tablet from Assurbanipal's library, a final inscription survives. May he who reads these words remember my name. It is a plea that could have been written by Sargon himself. Civilizations change their gods, their borders, their languages, but not their need to be remembered. That need was Akkad's truest invention. When the last stylus fell silent, the wedge marks remained, tiny impressions on clay, the fingerprints of an idea that refused to die. The plain where Akkad once stood is quiet now. Wind moves through the reeds. The rivers have wandered miles from their ancient beds. Farmers till the same soil that once fed the world's first empire, unaware that beneath their ploughs lie the ashes of kings. No city remains, no wall, no gate, only the echo of a name that refused to vanish. That name, Akkad, became something larger than a place. It turned into a metaphor for ambition itself, the dream that human hands could order the world and bind chaos in brick and law. From the first day, Sargon raised his banners to the last wedge pressed into clay 2,000 years later. The idea of empire has carried its shadow. Through the long centuries that followed, Akkad survived in fragments. Babylon's priests preserved its stories. Assyria's kings imitated its crowns. Persia borrowed its bureaucracy. Greece and Rome inherited its vision of universal rule. Even as its language faded, its structure endured. The rhythm of command, the faith in record, the belief that memory could be engineered. The scholar Berossus, writing in Babylon around 290 years before Christ, was one of the last men still able to read the old tablets. In his Babyloniaca, he retold the history of the world, from the flood to Sargon's conquests, blending fact and legend. To Greek audiences, he described kings who had built cities along shifting rivers and united lands under a single will. The listeners may not have known the word Akkad, but they recognized its pattern. When Alexander the Great marched into Mesopotamia, he did so as the heir to that pattern. He lingered in Babylon after his campaigns, poring over its omens and archives. The priests read to him the prophecies of Sargon and Naram-Sin, warning that rulers who defied the gods would fall young. Alexander smiled, accepting the risk. To him, empire was not a warning. It was destiny. Like Sargon, he called himself Lord of all lands from sunrise to sunset. Later conquerors would repeat the same vow. The Parthians, the Sassanids, the Caliphs, each drew their lines of power across the same rivers. Each ruled from cities that stood on buried ziggurats. In their proclamations, in their ceremonies, in their administrative systems, the pattern of Akkad reappeared again and again. The central city, the standardized tax, the divine monarch. Civilization remembered even when it forgot. Language carried that memory longer than stone. Akkadian, though silent for centuries, left its imprint on the tongues that replaced it. Aramaic absorbed its words for law and authority. Later, Arabic inherited some of its rhythms. When modern scholars cracked the code of cuneiform in the 19th century, they found themselves reading phrases that still sounded familiar. The same logic of order, written 3 millennia before Latin. For archaeologists, Akkad became a ghost to chase. The mask of Sargon, the Besetki statue, the burnt palaces of Tel Brak. Each discovery was a letter in the empire's long-lost alphabet. Every fragment deepened the mystery. Where was the capital itself? Somewhere between Baghdad and Babylon, perhaps, buried under layers of silt. The search continues, a quiet reminder that history's most enduring empires are sometimes those that cannot be found. The rediscovery of Akkad changed more than scholarship. It altered how humanity saw itself. For the first time, archaeologists could trace civilization's lineage not from Greece or Rome, but from older soil, from the people who first named time, first measured distance, first believed that a city could represent the world. The story of Akkad became the story of beginnings, not just of empire, but of memory, writing, and ambition. Modern Iraq inherited that legacy in ways both proud and perilous. When nationalism rose in the 20th century, politicians invoked Sargon the Great as the father of unity, the first ruler to make the land between the rivers one. In Baghdad, reliefs of the Akkadian kings were cast in bronze. Streets were named after them. The empire of clay became a symbol of endurance. Yet its ruins also became casualties. Wars scattered its relics. Museums were looted, and the same rivers that had once carried power now carried loss. The past remained powerful, but fragile. Even so, Akkad continues to speak. Every cuneiform tablet deciphered adds a heartbeat to its silence. Through them, we hear the rhythm of daily life. A soldier requesting rations, a merchant swearing an oath, a poet praising a god. The grand inscriptions of kings are joined by the quiet voices of ordinary people who live beneath those walls. Their words bridge the gulf of 4,000 years, proving that empire, for all its pride, was built by human hands and human hopes. Scholars today study not only how Akkad ruled, but how it ended. The 4.2 kilo-year drought, confirmed by climate science, reveals how fragile its achievements were. A few decades of failed rain were enough to undo a century of brilliance. Civilization, it seems, has always lived at the mercy of the elements it tries to control. In that truth lies Akkad's most enduring lesson. The clay tablets of the ancient world close with formulas of humility. May future generations remember. The Akkadians wrote those words, knowing how easily time forgets. Yet in their own way, they succeeded. Every empire that followed borrowed something from them. Rome's bureaucracy, China's concept of the mandate, the modern state's dependence on record and administration. Sargon's experiment became the grammar of power itself. Empire, Akkad taught, is never only territory. It is an idea that the world can be catalogued, measured, and made coherent through the will of a single center. It is also a warning that the center always expands until it breaks. In the ruins of Ur and Nineveh, in the libraries of Europe, in the laboratories where scientists read the isotopes of ancient drought, Akkad still speaks of ambition and its price, of unity and its cost, of memory and its endurance. If you walk the plains between the rivers today, you might not see walls or temples, but the air itself carries a strange familiarity. The same wind that once filled the sails of Sargon's fleets moves through the reeds. The same horizon that drew his armies westward still stretches unbroken to the sea. Perhaps that is Akkad's truest survival. Not the stones that vanished, but the pattern it set. The idea that order can rise from chaos, that writing can defeat time, that human beings, for all their frailty, will keep trying to build forever. 4,000 years have passed since Sargon poured his libation to the gods of the four quarters. The empire he founded fell, and so did every empire after it. Yet the impulse that began in his city still shapes our world. Until the last tablet is read and the last tell is excavated, the story continues. The ghost of Akkad remains, watching, reminding, whispering through the dust, that greatness is always borrowed, never owned, and that every dream of empire begins and ends in the same silence.